November 1846, in a sprawling Louisiana plantation shrouded in moss-draped oaks, a night unlike any other was unfolding. The air was thick with the sweetness of decaying magnolias and the acrid sting of candle smoke. Servants moved silently, as if the shadows themselves whispered warnings. But the mistress of the house, a woman known for her cold beauty and sharper temper, had other plans. She commanded her male slaves to entertain her desires, parading them before her husband, who watched with detached amusement. What began as a picture of genteel southern civility turned into a dark, grotesque theater of power, submission, and cruelty. This is the true story of Madeleine Leroux, whose wealth and privilege masked a sinister appetite that corrupted every corner of her household. You might think this is just another story of slavery's horrors, but the events at Leroux Plantation reveal a level of calculated manipulation and voyeuristic cruelty that history has largely chosen to forget. Before we continue, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you want access to exclusive uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member, and don't forget to hit the like button. Let's be real. Louisiana in 1846 was a place where the rich lived in painted splendor while the oppressed toiled in silence. Picture the plantation from above, acres of cotton fields stretching into the horizon, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay. The grand house, whitewashed and proud, perched like a sentinel over its domain, balconies draped in ivy, windows reflecting the dying sun. Beneath its elegance, however, a shadow existed that the outside world would never see, a world governed by fear, ritual, and desire. Life for the slaves here was defined by labor from sunrise to sunset, broken only by the arbitrary whims of the Lerouxs. The year was a turning point, not just for the household, but for the men who would become unwilling players in a cruel spectacle. You have to understand, the plantation was more than a home. It was a carefully curated theater with each room, each candle, each whispered order designed to maintain an illusion of civility while hiding unimaginable cruelty. The humid air pressed against skin like a living thing, and every sound, the scrape of boots, the snapping of a whip, the distant call of a riverboat, became part of the tension, a reminder that every movement was being watched. Madeleine Leroux, the mistress, was both elegant and terrifying. Her husband, Henry, a man of imposing stature, carried the calm, detached gaze of someone who observed rather than intervened. Now picture this. To neighbors, they were a model couple, hosting soirees with laughter, fine wine, and polite conversation. But behind closed doors, their personas split. Madeleine's charisma concealed an appetite for domination, while Henry's presence lent validation to every cruel act. Both were flawed, human in their desires, yet monstrously aware of the power imbalance they wielded. It's tempting to cast them as pure villains, but the truth is far more unsettling. Their cruelty was methodical, almost ritualistic, the product of privilege, entitlement, and a society that taught them they could act with impunity. The men who served them were not merely slaves, they were instruments, unwitting actors in a performance designed to assert absolute control. Their humanity was acknowledged only to the extent that it could serve the household's grotesque theater. The public-facing narrative was meticulous. To the world, the Lerouxs appeared as devout, philanthropic members of society, their wealth earned from cotton, their lives devoted to charity and hospitality. Visitors would remark on the grandeur, the order, the impeccable manners of the staff, never suspecting the horrors lurking within. This was the beauty of the lie. It was convincing because it aligned perfectly with societal expectations. The outside world saw a household that embodied the genteel traditions of the South, not a domestic chamber of terror. Every smile, every bow, every polite word was a layer of deception. And here's the key. The Lerouxs depended on this illusion not just to protect their reputation, but to continue their exploitative practices without scrutiny. The stakes were high, and suspicion was a luxury no one could afford. Now you have to understand, cruelty of this scale doesn't operate without infrastructure. Secret rooms, soundproof chambers, and discreet staff assignments created the perfect environment for exploitation. Overseers were complicit, conditioned to treat the slaves as tools rather than humans. Passwords, coded signals, and rigid schedules ensured every moment was monitored, every transgression punished or corrected before it could escape notice. The plantation itself became a weapon, with walls, corridors, and balconies designed not just for aesthetics, but to amplify control and fear. The men who worked there had no privacy, no sanctuary. Everything they did, every glance, every hesitation was watched, catalogued, and judged. This level of orchestration hints at something more than personal cruelty. It was a system, a microcosm of domination refined over generations. Neighbors noticed oddities, of course, strange rituals, servants' nervous glances, whispered conversations cut short whenever outsiders approached. But there were always logical explanations ready: health concerns, disciplinary measures, or the eccentricities of the household. Just strict management, they'd say. A spirited mistress, nothing more. And the community believed it, because the lie was convenient, tidy, and socially comforting. Plausibility was a shield, shielding the LaRues from investigation while normalizing the abnormal. This is where history becomes murky. The truth was buried under layers of polite denial, societal complicity, and self-deception. Every system needs an enabler, and the LaRues had several. Foremen, housemaids, and senior staff ensured that the mistress's desires were met without question. These collaborators weren't mindless. They were humans driven by fear, loyalty, or personal gain. One, in particular, a middle-aged overseer named Samuel Dupre, knew too much and yet facilitated the abuses, rationalizing his actions as duty or survival. It's tempting to condemn him entirely, but he was trapped within a hierarchy that left him little choice, a cog in the machinery of oppression. His presence ensured that the acts could continue unseen, his silence amplifying the horror of complicity. The victims were young men, mostly in their late teens or early 20s, torn from families and thrust into an existence stripped of autonomy. Their lives were defined by labor, fear, and degradation, yet they retained flickers of humanity that the LaRues sought to crush. Names, faces, small acts of resistance. These were erased, replaced with identities that suited the household's needs. Vulnerable physically and emotionally, they were often powerless to speak, their suffering hidden behind the plantation's polished facade. Each carried trauma that would linger long after any immediate abuses ended, and some would internalize guilt or shame, unaware that the true blame lay with the privileged couple who orchestrated their torment. Enter Thomas Baird, a young stable hand who had stumbled upon a ritual one evening while fetching water he wasn't meant to see, yet there he stood, pressed against a wall, witnessing acts of cruelty that would haunt him for life. The mistress's gaze briefly met his, a flicker of recognition that sent a cold shiver down his spine. At that moment, he became a threat, not just a witness. Fear gripped him as he understood that silence was the only path to survival, and yet something inside him refused to allow the injustice to go unrecorded. His discovery would become the thread that slowly began to unravel the LaRues' carefully constructed world. Thomas Baird returned to his quarters that night, but sleep would not come. The humid air of the stable, once a place of labor and routine, now felt like a suffocating cage, pressing against his chest with every breath. Every shadow seemed to twist into the faces he had glimpsed. The stern, detached gaze of Henry LaRue, the calculating smile of Madeline, and the frightened, trembling expressions of the young men forced to perform before them. He tried to speak, to tell someone, anyone, what he had seen, but fear was a more powerful master than morality. Even the trusted overseer, Samuel Dupre, had warned him subtly but unmistakably. Some things are best left buried. Now, you have to understand, the cost of revealing the truth was far greater than mere disapproval. It could mean eviction, punishment, or death. Thomas's mind became a battlefield between conscience and survival. His hands shook, his stomach churned, and yet the images refused to fade. Daylight brought no relief. The plantation seemed alive with whispers of the night's horrors. The other slaves carried on with their labor, oblivious, or perhaps too fearful to acknowledge, the invisible specter of the events that had unfolded. Thomas began to question his own sanity. Could it truly have happened, or had his imagination betrayed him in the oppressive darkness? This is where the story gets truly chilling. The very structure of the plantation, the hierarchy of fear and obedience, was designed to silence witnesses, to render them invisible, and to normalize cruelty as everyday routine. Thomas was trapped in a nightmare that had no natural end, and the longer he carried the secret, the more the horror seemed to seep into every corner of his life. The psychological toll was immediate and relentless, leaving him isolated, anxious, and hyper-aware of the LaRue's omnipresent gaze, a living testament to the power of terror as a tool of control. Now, you have to understand, even when whispers of wrongdoing reached the ears of local authorities, the response was meticulously staged to protect the LaRues and the illusion of order. A superficial inquiry was launched, ostensibly to investigate complaints about labor conditions, but in reality it was a performance designed to quell suspicion without ever threatening the household. Officials arrived in crisp uniforms, notebooks in hand, and asked polite, scripted questions, while ignoring the trembling testimonies of those too fearful to speak fully. Thomas Baird, summoned under the guise of routine questioning, found his words twisted, minimized, or outright dismissed. Overactive imagination, they said. Young men exaggerate hardships. Let's be real, the system was designed to fail the moment it encountered the truth. The inquiries provided the LaRues with a shield, an official stamp of legitimacy that could be shown to neighbors, investors, and the broader society. Meanwhile, the very men tasked with enforcing justice were often beneficiaries of the plantation's wealth, personally invested in maintaining the status quo. I want you to picture the scene. The grand hall, sunlight slanting through tall windows, officials nodding and taking notes, while behind the closed doors, the same abuses Thomas had witnessed continued unabated. The inquiry became a ritual of denial, a masterclass in the art of plausible explanation, ensuring that any outsider who glimpsed the darkness saw only the light carefully curated for them. It was a theater of compliance, a system that punished curiosity and rewarded silence. And through it all, the LaRues watched, smug in the knowledge that their carefully constructed world of fear and control remained unchallenged, at least for now. This is where the cracks begin to form, but the full unraveling would take time, and courage far beyond what most could summon. The men who survived Madeleine LaRue's twisted spectacles bore marks that went far beyond bruises or scars. They were living, breathing testaments to cruelty disguised as authority. Now, you have to understand, the horrors they endured were designed to strip them of autonomy and identity, leaving deep psychological fractures that could never fully heal. Some walked the fields with heads lowered, eyes vacant, their bodies taut with tension, muscles permanently hardened by fear. Others spoke in muted tones, words halting and fragmented, as if the memory of the performances they were forced into had carved invisible lines into their very speech. It's almost impossible to describe what it looked like to an outsider. A group of men moving in choreographed submission, their physical forms seemingly intact, yet internally shattered, each step and gesture a carefully calculated act of survival. I want you to picture one of them, Joseph, barely 19, once vibrant and sharp-eyed, now flinching at every raised voice, every unexpected movement, haunted by memories of a mistress's laughter ringing in his ears and the cold, approving gaze of her husband. The transformation was both horrifying and telling. The LaRues had created not just victims, but walking evidence of their power, proof that resistance was futile and fear was absolute. These men became living monuments to control, their altered behaviors a silent warning to anyone who might consider defiance. The plantation itself seemed to pulse with their trauma, each whispered caution and trembling glance a reminder that the cruelty was systemic, inescapable, and normalized. The tragedy lies not only in the acts themselves, but in the way they endured, adapting to survive while the world outside remained willfully blind, choosing comfort and convenience over the uncomfortable truths simmering behind plantation walls. Their essence told a story the authorities would never fully acknowledge, a narrative of suffering that spoke louder than any official report ever could. Now, you have to understand, what made Madeleine Leroux's cruelty so chilling wasn't mere whimsy. It was calculated, almost surgical in precision. The rituals, the punishments, the orchestrated performances were not random acts of sadism. They followed a method designed to break both body and spirit while simultaneously reinforcing the mistress's absolute control. I want you to picture the layout of the plantation's hidden chambers, dimly lit, strategically arranged to maximize exposure and fear, with mirrors positioned to reflect every movement, ensuring the men felt perpetually watched, always evaluated. Madeleine kept meticulous records, notes on behavior, reactions, and compliance, almost as if conducting an experiment. Each slave was tested for obedience, resistance, and adaptability, with deviations noted and punished. Even the timing of commands, the choice of accomplices, and the pacing of the acts was deliberate, meant to prevent habituation, to ensure that terror remained fresh, immediate, and paralyzing. Let's be real. There was a cruel artistry to it, a systematic observation of human vulnerability elevated to performance art in the most perverse sense. And Henry Leroux's role was equally deliberate. His presence as a detached observer provided validation and normalized the abuse, creating a feedback loop of fear and compliance. The plantation became a laboratory of domination, where psychological conditioning, physical coercion, and voyeurism were intertwined in a sophisticated, terrifying system. The men were not merely coerced, they were studied, measured, and manipulated with precision. This is where the story gets truly chilling. The horrors of Leroux Plantation were not chaotic or impulsive. They were engineered, refined, and executed with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Each act, each reaction, each silent terror contributed to a pattern, a methodology that ensured the mistress's desires were satisfied and the men remained powerless. It's the cold logic behind the cruelty that transforms horror into something almost impossible to comprehend, leaving the audience, and Thomas Baird, the accidental witness, grappling with a truth that defies moral understanding. Enter Elijah Fontaine, a man whose past was as complicated as the world he was about to confront. Now you have to understand, he wasn't a knight in shining armor or a figure of perfect morality. He was a former journalist, exiled from New Orleans for exposing corruption that few dared to acknowledge. Haunted by his own failures, by stories left untold, he carried a restless drive to unearth truth, even when it threatened his safety. When rumors of the Leroux Plantation reached him, whispered in smoky taverns and back alleys, something inside stirred. He knew the stakes. Wealth, power, and societal complicity protected the guilty, while the innocent suffered in silence. But Elijah was relentless, flawed, and deeply human. He drank too much, swore under his breath, and bore scars, both emotional and physical, from past confrontations. And yet, beneath the rough exterior was a mind tuned to deception, observation, and subtlety, a mind capable of infiltrating worlds most would flee from in terror. I want you to picture him arriving in the Louisiana swamps, the scent of damp cypress and rotting vegetation clinging to his coat, the air thick with humidity and the distant cries of unseen creatures. He moved cautiously, noting the placement of each building, the behavior of the staff, and the whispers carried by the wind. Elijah understood instinctively that Leroux Plantation wasn't merely a physical place. It was a psychological labyrinth, designed to ensnare the unwary. And yet, he stepped inside, aware of the danger, compelled by a conviction that some truths demanded revelation. This is where the narrative pivots, from the suffering of victims to the courage of someone willing to risk everything to expose a meticulously concealed atrocity. His journey wouldn't be clean or simple, but it would be necessary, and through his eyes, the audience would begin to see the full, terrifying depth of the Leroux's depravity. Elijah Fontaine didn't storm the plantation with fanfare. He entered like a shadow, blending into the rhythms of the estate, while observing every nuance of its dark underbelly. Now you have to understand, this wasn't an ordinary investigation. Every step he took carried immense risk. One misstep could expose him to the wrath of Madeleine Leroux, the scrutiny of her husband, or the silent complicity of staff who would report any perceived disloyalty. He assumed the guise of a lowly labor overseer, notebook hidden beneath his coat, eyes constantly scanning, ears attuned to the subtlest sounds, a stifled sob, a whispered command, the creak of floorboards signaling movement behind closed doors. I want you to picture him at night, moving through candle-lit corridors, the smell of damp wood and burning tallow filling his senses, each flickering shadow a potential threat. He memorized schedules, documented routines, and listened for inconsistencies in the stories of staff who might unwittingly reveal truths about the mistress's secret performances. The more he observed, the more the horrifying pattern emerged. Madeline's acts were choreographed, her husband's gaze a tool of intimidation, and the men, those poor, altered souls, were both audience and unwilling participants. Elijah's notebook filled with painstaking detail, dates, times, reactions, and layouts of hidden chambers. Let's be real. The courage required to remain present while witnessing these abuses cannot be overstated. He couldn't intervene openly. Doing so would have meant instant exposure and failure. Yet, with each passing day, he grew more certain that evidence existed, that the cruelty could be documented, and that the world outside the plantation could, if shown the truth, finally see the depravity for what it was. The tension was relentless. Every glance, every whispered instruction, every subtle nod of complicity had to be recorded without alerting the LaRues. While the weight of human suffering pressed on him like the oppressive Louisiana heat, Elijah's investigation wasn't just an act of courage, it was a psychological tightrope walk through a house engineered to destroy anyone who dared to look too closely. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. Elijah Fontaine has now embedded himself deep inside LaRue Plantation, moving like a shadow through candle-lit hallways, his every step measured, every glance calculated. Now you have to understand the danger is constant. One misstep, one hushed whisper overheard, could expose him to Madeline's wrath or Henry's cold scrutiny. I want you to picture the scene. Flickering lanterns casting long, dancing shadows, servants shifting nervously under watchful eyes, the faint echo of footsteps in hidden chambers, each sound a possible revelation or threat. Elijah documents everything, the routines, the patterns, the subtle signs of fear etched into the faces of the enslaved men. And just like him, you are standing at the edge of this terrifying truth, peering into a world most would never dare to see. Comment, subscribe, and share your thoughts, because the evidence Elijah is about to uncover will be undeniable, and it will force you to confront a reality that the LaRues worked so hard to hide. Are you ready to see the horror revealed? Elijah Fontaine's relentless observation and careful infiltration finally yielded what he had been seeking: irrefutable proof of the LaRues' grotesque abuses. Now, you have to understand, this was not some fleeting rumor or half-heard whisper. It was the cold, undeniable documentation of horror meticulously recorded by the perpetrators themselves. Late one humid evening, following subtle cues and hushed warnings from terrified staff who could speak only in hints, Elijah stumbled upon a hidden chamber beneath the grand plantation house. I want you to picture the scene, the air stagnant with the scent of mold and burning tallow, shadows twisting across the low walls, the faint creak of floorboards echoing like a ghostly warning. Inside, neatly stacked journals, ledgers, and crude sketches revealed the full scope of Madeleine LaRue's orchestrated spectacles: names of male slaves, dates of performances, punishments for minor defiance, and diagrams illustrating the exact choreography of domination and humiliation. Every detail, every calculated act of cruelty, had been recorded as though it were an experiment, a cold, methodical study of fear and obedience. Let's be real. The weight of this discovery was suffocating. This was no chaotic or impulsive cruelty. It was systematic, organized, and engineered to break body, mind, and spirit. Elijah documented it all, transcribing testimonies from frightened staff, drawing diagrams of hidden passageways, and recording patterns that corroborated multiple sources. For the first time, the LaRue's private horrors were made tangible, transforming whispered rumors into verifiable evidence that could never be ignored. The implications were staggering. a blueprint of human cruelty, meticulously preserved, now in the hands of someone willing to expose it to the world. Elijah Fontaine had the evidence in his hands, every page and diagram a testament to cruelty he could no longer ignore. Now, you have to understand, leaving LaRue Plantation alive would be far from simple. He moved like a shadow through the humid, oppressive night, heart pounding, listening to the chirp of crickets and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures as he navigated narrow corridors and hidden stairwells. I want you to picture the moment he descended into the swampy outskirts, the air thick with the scent of mud, decay, and wet cypress. Each step was measured, but even the softest movement carried risk. A creaking floorboard or the snap of a twig could alert the LaRues or their complicit overseers. And then it happened. A sudden shout, a lantern swinging in the distance, and the unmistakable sound of pursuit. Let's be real. The terror was immediate, raw, and visceral. Elijah ran, slipping through knee-deep water and brambles, the manuscripts clutched to his chest, pages dampening but intact. The pursuit was relentless. Voices barked commands, dogs bayed in the shadows, and the swamps themselves seemed to conspire against him, sucking at his boots, tangling his legs and roots. Each breath came ragged, each heartbeat a drum of imminent danger. Yet, amidst the fear, Elijah's mind remained sharp. He memorized landmarks, calculated shortcuts, and trusted instincts honed from years of investigative work. Hours stretched like eternity until finally he glimpsed the dim lights of a distant cabin, a faint promise of safety and witness to what he had uncovered. The chase was over, but the true battle, the exposure of the LaRue's horrors, was only just beginning. Elijah Fontaine finally emerged from the swamp, the Louisiana night giving way to the faint glow of lanterns in a nearby settlement. Now, you have to understand, survival did not guarantee justice. He carried irrefutable evidence of the LaRue's atrocities, journals, diagrams, and first-hand testimonies. But the world beyond the plantation was a different kind of peril. I want you to picture the scene, his clothes soaked, smeared with mud, boots heavy with swamp water, yet clutching every page like a lifeline. The taverns and dusty streets he once knew seemed strangely alien under the weight of his discovery. People greeted him politely, curious but unknowing of the horrors he bore, and here the reversal began. Those who should have been outraged, local officials, newspapers, even clergy, met his revelations with disbelief, hesitation, or convenient rationalizations. "Are you certain, Mr. Fontaine?" they asked, peering over spectacles, their expressions a mix of doubt and unease. "This seems exaggerated." Let's be real. The shock was not just the story itself, but the societal machinery that refused to see it. Wealth, status, and the genteel facade of Southern plantation life insulated the LaRues, and now Elijah confronted the bitter truth. Facts alone were not enough to shake a community invested in ignorance. Some offered cautious sympathy, others discreet dismissal, but nearly all preferred to maintain the comforting illusion that evil could not exist behind the doors of respectable households. And yet, he could not allow disbelief to halt him. He visited editors, officials, and anyone willing to listen, painstakingly recounting patterns, citing names, and presenting diagrams of hidden chambers. Each attempt met resistance, but Elijah's determination only intensified. He had seen the horror, documented it meticulously, and would not allow the veneer of civility to erase the suffering he had uncovered. In this moment, the triumph of discovery collided with the frustration of society's denial, revealing that unmasking evil often required more than proof. It demanded the courage to persist against disbelief, prejudice, and apathy. The battle was shifting from swamp and plantation to minds, hearts, and public conscience, and Elijah realized that the fight for truth was far from over. The moment of reckoning finally arrived. Armed with Elijah Fontaine's meticulously documented evidence, authorities organized a raid on LaRue Plantation, moving under the cover of dawn when shadows still clung to the moss-draped oaks. Now, you have to understand, this was not a simple act of law enforcement. It was the culmination of painstaking investigation, courage, and months of silent observation. I want you to picture the scene. Lanterns bobbing against the plantation's imposing facade, the low hum of whispered commands, and the tense anticipation of officers stepping onto creaking floorboards that had once concealed horrors beyond imagination. As doors were forced open, the stench of damp wood and fear immediately hit the intruders, a tangible reminder of the suffering within. Behind one concealed panel lay the chamber Elijah had discovered, the private theater of Madeleine LaRue's orchestrated spectacles. Inside, journals, sketches, and makeshift furniture revealed the systematic cruelty inflicted upon the male slaves, arranged with chilling precision. Every detail matched Elijah's accounts, mirrors angled to amplify terror, hidden passages for surveillance, and remnants of rituals meant to dominate, degrade, and humiliate. The shock was palpable. Even hardened officers struggled to reconcile the meticulous order of the chamber with the horrors it had hosted. Let's be real, the reality was more grotesque than anyone had imagined. Each artifact, each ledger, each faint mark on the walls told a story of suffering, fear, and human manipulation. The raid did not merely uncover evidence, it revealed a world engineered for domination. A macabre theater in which humanity was subjugated for the twisted satisfaction of privilege. For the first time, the atrocities of the LaRues could not be ignored, denied, or sanitized. They were laid bare, stark, and undeniable, a testament to both the cruelty of the powerful and the courage of those who dared to expose it. With the raid complete and the chamber of horrors exposed, the true faces of the LaRues emerged from behind their carefully constructed facades. Now, you have to understand, what society had admired as refinement, wealth, and genteel manners was nothing more than a mask concealing calculated depravity. Madeleine LaRue, once regarded as a paragon of Southern elegance, revealed herself as a manipulator of minds and bodies. A woman who weaponized desire, fear, and obedience to satisfy her own perverse whims. Her charisma, the polite smiles, the gracious gestures, all had been carefully cultivated tools of control. Henry LaRue, outwardly calm and detached, was no passive bystander. His silent complicity, his measured presence during the acts, and his subtle enforcement of discipline made him an architect of terror alongside his wife. I want you to picture the moment they were confronted, the once commanding figures, poised behind polished veneers, now flinching under the weight of exposure, their power evaporating in the harsh light of truth. Officers recounted their incredulity as the couple's justifications faltered, excuses replaced by silence, and arrogance dissolved into palpable fear. Let's be real, their carefully constructed world, supported by wealth, status, and community denial, crumbled in the span of hours. Each ledger, each journal, each hidden passage documented not only the acts of cruelty, but also the meticulous orchestration that allowed them to remain untouchable for so long. In unmasking the LaRues, society finally glimpsed the full scope of human manipulation, the corrosive effect of unchecked power, and the terrifying capacity for cruelty disguised as civility. The villains were revealed, not as distant shadows, but as real, flawed, and horrifyingly human actors in a drama that history had almost forgotten. As the investigation unfolded, a disturbing truth became clear. The LaRue's cruelty was not confined to their plantation. Now, you have to understand, their actions were part of a broader web of exploitation, a shadowy network that stretched far beyond the moss-draped oaks of Louisiana. I want you to picture the intricate chain of correspondence, financial ledgers, and coded communications uncovered in their hidden chambers. Letters revealed arrangements with other plantations, distant merchants, and even influential figures in New Orleans, all complicit, wittingly or not, in maintaining a system that allowed abuses to persist in secrecy. The journals detailed methods and schedules, shared best practices for maintaining control over those enslaved, and offered guidance on suppressing suspicion. Let's be real, the horror multiplied when it became evident that the LaRues were not isolated actors, but participants in an insidious, organized network, where wealth, social standing, and influence ensured that accountability remained elusive. The scope of the crime extended beyond individual suffering, demonstrating a systemic problem embedded in society's hierarchy and commerce. Every revelation intensified the sense of betrayal. Institutions meant to protect the vulnerable had been manipulated or corrupted, while the machinery of power shielded those who exploited it. Elijah Fontaine's documentation made it impossible to ignore these connections, exposing a network of complicity, greed, and moral corruption that transcended the plantation and spanned the region, revealing that evil rarely exists in isolation. It thrives where oversight, conscience, and accountability fail. Now, you have to understand, the horrors of LaRue Plantation were only able to persist because society, in countless ways, chose to look away. The wealthy, the influential, and even the clergy maintained a delicate veil of civility, turning a blind eye to abuses that were whispered about but never acknowledged. I want you to picture the polite parlors of New Orleans, the smoke-filled salons, the gatherings of elites sipping wine and exchanging pleasantries, while beneath the surface, the machinery of terror continued unabated. Let's be real. Denial wasn't just convenient, it was protective. To admit the truth would have destabilized social hierarchies, challenged economic power, and forced recognition of a system built on oppression. Newspapers carefully curated their reports, glossing over rumors or dismissing accounts as exaggeration. Officials accepted bribes or relied on plausible deniability, while neighbors whispered warnings but refused to confront the LaRues directly. Even those closest to the victims were coerced into silence, their fear reinforced by the knowledge that speaking out could bring punishment, or worse. This conspiracy of silence extended beyond self-preservation. It was a societal agreement that evil existed only where it was convenient to ignore it. Elijah Fontaine realized that exposing the truth required more than evidence. It required piercing the collective denial of a community invested in its own illusions. The LaRues thrived not only because of their cunning, but because the world around them chose ignorance over accountability, allowing horrors to continue hidden in plain sight, shielded by status, privilege, and complicity. The fall of the LaRues was swift in some ways, but the consequences for each player unfolded with a complexity befitting the cruelty they had orchestrated. Now you have to understand, justice was never neat, nor was it immediate. Madeleine LaRue, stripped of her facade of refinement, faced the full glare of public scrutiny. I want you to picture her in the courtroom, her carefully arranged hair slightly disheveled, the sharp elegance of her gown now a silent testament to lost control, her eyes darting between officers, witnesses, and the rows of spectators hungry to see her unmasked. Convicted of abuse, manipulation, and the systematic terror of the enslaved men, she was sentenced to imprisonment, her wealth confiscated, and her name forever tarnished in history's ledger. Henry LaRue fared slightly differently. His role, though no less complicit, was tempered by the societal reluctance to fully condemn men of his status. He received a lighter sentence, largely due to legal maneuvering and the perception that his detachment mitigated direct responsibility, though privately, the psychological weight of exposure haunted him. Samuel Dupré and other enablers faced prosecution, their complicity laid bare, but like Henry, some escaped the full extent of punishment, shielded by privilege or clever testimony. Elijah Fontaine, the relentless truth-seeker, emerged battered but vindicated. Though physically and emotionally drained, he had ensured that evidence could no longer be denied, that the victims' stories would endure. Yet even he recognized that exposing the LaRues was only one battle in a larger war against systemic cruelty and societal denial. Let's be real. The outcomes were imperfect. Justice was partial and uneven, a reflection of the very structures that allowed the LaRues to thrive for so long. Still, the exposure of their crimes set a precedent, a cautionary tale, and a marker in history that no amount of wealth, status, or deception could entirely erase. Each key player, villain and hero alike, was forever transformed, their fates a mixture of punishment, survival, and the enduring weight of moral reckoning. The story of LaRue Plantation did not end with prison sentences or confiscated wealth. It lingered, a shadow stretching long over Louisiana and beyond. Now, you have to understand, the legacy of this cruelty was as much psychological and societal as it was legal. The survivors carried scars that would never fully heal, their lives forever marked by the orchestrated horrors of Madeleine Leroux's whims. Yet their resilience became a quiet testament to human endurance, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the will to survive and the spark of resistance cannot be entirely extinguished. I want you to picture the plantation decades later, moss clinging to walls, the grand house abandoned and slowly crumbling, whispers of its history carried in the wind through the swamps, a haunting echo of suffering and secrecy. Let's be real. The moral is clear and uncomfortable. Power, when unchecked and combined with societal complicity, can enable atrocities hidden in plain sight. This story challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, privilege, and the systems we allow to exist unquestioned. Elijah Fontaine's work ensured the Lerouxs could not be forgotten, and the accounts of survivors became a lens through which history could examine the depths of cruelty and the necessity of courage. Their experiences demand remembrance, reflection, and accountability. The legacy is twofold: a warning about the dangers of silence and privilege, and a tribute to those who dared to resist, to document, and to bear witness. In acknowledging this past, we confront not just historical horror, but the ongoing responsibility to recognize injustice wherever it lurks, to listen to the silenced, and to ensure that human dignity is never again subordinated to the whims of the powerful. As we leave the shadows of Leroux Plantation, one question lingers. Could something like this happen today, in some hidden corner of our world, quietly unfolding behind a polished facade? Now, you have to understand, the horrors we've uncovered are not confined to history books. They are a warning, a reflection of the dangers of privilege, secrecy, and collective denial. I want you to picture the swamps, the decaying house, the journals and ledgers that survived decades of silence, testaments to human cruelty, but also to courage and truth. Let's be real. The story is haunting because it forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about power and complicity, and it asks us to consider what we might do if faced with similar darkness. This is Echoes of Truth. And if you followed Elijah Fontaine's journey, you've witnessed bravery, horror, and the fragility of societal conscience. Comment below with your thoughts, share your reflections, and subscribe to join us in uncovering more stories hidden in history's shadows. And for those ready for the next descent into mystery, stay tuned. Our next tale reveals a secret that has been buried for over a century, a story of betrayal, obsession, and a disappearance that the world never fully explained. Prepare yourself, because the shadows are waiting, and the truth is closer than you think.